I need some hand sanitizer. Hold on.
I got it.
I've been out in the streets amongst the people. Yeah, I gotta take a bath. Like the amount of people that actually I'm coming in contact with, like that's what I have to do. You know what I'm saying?
The footage wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with a statement. It didn't come from an official release. It just appeared. And that's what made it unsettling. What began circulating wasn't framed as a headline or a breaking alert. It showed up quietly, passed between people who already knew how to look at it. Grainy, unpolished, nothing cinematic. Just enough detail to raise a question that couldn't be ignored. Why does this exist at all? The images don't try to explain themselves. They don't tell you what happened. They don't come with context or captions spelling anything out. They simply show a version of reality that doesn't match the narrative most people assumed was in place. A controlled environment, a contained situation, business as usual. That assumption doesn't sit comfortably once you've seen the footage.
Get off the phone right now, and I am going to let you professionals look at the situation and come back to me with a solution. No matter what nobody said. Let's just here and there, y'all are not working together the right way. We're losing.
What stands out isn't drama, it's condition, body language, stillness. The way someone looks when they're not performing for cameras and don't expect the moment to travel beyond the room it happened in. According to circulating reports, this footage appears after an incident inside the facility on Monday, January 19th. Accounts suggest an altercation involving multiple inmates. Nothing officially confirmed. No public incident report released, just fragments, timing, and visuals that raise more questions than answers. And that's where the tension lives, because if nothing unusual happened, there would be nothing to hide. No reason for images like this to exist outside internal channels. No reason for silence to follow. The footage doesn't show chaos, it doesn't show a fight. What it shows is aftermath, the kind that usually stays off record. Visible injuries, subtle movements that suggest discomfort, a presence that feels smaller than expected. This isn't about shock, it's about contrast. Public image versus private reality. Power outside versus vulnerability inside. Prison doesn't operate on reputation, it operates on environment. Status changes, control changes. Influence doesn't move the same way it does beyond the walls. And that shift rewrites everything people think they know about how situations are handled. Reports suggest medical attention is currently ongoing within the facility. Language used by officials, as relayed through secondary sources, is careful. Being treated, monitored, under care, phrases that acknowledge condition without inviting questions. That kind of wording is familiar. It doesn't deny anything. It doesn't confirm much either. And that space in between is where speculation grows. If you're watching closely and noticing how quietly this is being handled, make sure you're subscribed. Stories like this don't move fast, but they don't disappear either. What comes next usually happens when attention stays steady, not loud. What makes this moment different isn't the incident itself. Altercations happen inside facilities more often than people realize. What's different is who this involves and how quickly the narrative shifted from certainty to silence. Earlier expectations were clear: protective conditions, controlled environments, a sense that influence would extend inward. This footage challenges that idea without saying a word. Because once reality leaks, even briefly, control over the story weakens. Not immediately, not dramatically, quietly. No press conference followed, no official breakdown, no detailed denial, just absence. And absence, when it shows up right after something surfaces, doesn't feel accidental. It feels measured. This isn't about declaring what happened. It's about recognizing what's changed. A reminder that prison reality doesn't pause for reputation. It doesn't care about legacy. It doesn't operate on expectation. Inside, everyone adjusts. And when images like this surface, even without confirmation, they do something irreversible. They force people to reconsider assumptions they were comfortable holding. The story doesn't escalate here. It tightens, because now the question isn't what happened. It's what will be acknowledged next, if anything at all. And once that question exists, every silence that follows carries more weight than the last. This isn't the end of the story. It's the moment the narrative stopped feeling controlled. Once the footage began circulating, the conversation shifted quietly, not into outrage, not into headlines, into questions. Because what people were seeing didn't line up with what they were told to expect. This wasn't an image of control. It wasn't the look of someone insulated by status or protected by influence. It was something far more ordinary, and that's what made it unsettling. Ordinary vulnerability. According to circulating reports, the incident tied to this footage is said to have taken place on Monday, January 19th. The details are fragmented. No official statement spelling anything out. No public incident log released for review. Just accounts suggesting an altercation inside the facility involving multiple inmates. Nothing confirmed.
Anything that surprised you when you were watching?
I think it was surprising that he actually filmed it.
It was very interesting to watch a man who's known for his brand presence. You know, he has a really amazing knack for marketing and all of that, and how he was sort of taking that into account in how he was coming off to the public.
Nothing formally denied, and that silence matters. Because in environments like this, information doesn't disappear on its own. It's contained, managed, filtered, especially when visibility becomes a liability instead of an advantage. What the footage shows isn't action, it's aftermath. The part that usually stays internal. Physical condition that suggests something happened before the camera ever existed. Movements that look careful. A presence that feels restrained, not dominant. This isn't about dramatizing injuries. It's about acknowledging context. Prison dynamics don't pause for reputation. They don't adjust for past power. Inside status resets. Influence behaves differently. Control isn't assumed. It's negotiated moment by moment, often without warning. That's why reports of an altercation carry weight even without confirmation. Not because incidents are rare, but because expectations were different here. The assumption was that this situation would be managed quietly, smoothly, without disruption. The footage challenges that assumption without making a claim. What followed was just as telling as what came before. No immediate clarification, no visible effort to correct the narrative. Just carefully chosen language circulating through secondary channels. Phrases like receiving treatment, being monitored, under medical care. Those words acknowledge condition without inviting scrutiny. They don't say how. They don't say why. They don't say when. That kind of wording is designed to close conversation, not open it. And for a while it usually works. But once images exist, even briefly, control becomes harder to maintain. People start comparing what they see with what they're told. They notice what isn't being addressed. They track how long silence lasts. And silence has a shelf life. What's important here isn't proving what happened inside those walls. It's understanding why the narrative suddenly feels smaller, why expectations dropped, why confidence turned into caution almost overnight. This moment exposes a shift. Outside, power relies on access, influence, leverage. Inside, power relies on environment. An environment doesn't negotiate. That's why the footage feels heavier than it looks. It represents a loss of insulation, a reminder that once someone is inside, the rules change, quickly, permanently. No statement can undo that. As this story continues, attention isn't focused on the incident itself. It's focused on response. On whether clarity arrives or distance increases, on whether this is addressed directly or allowed to fade quietly. Because once reality leaks, even in fragments, it doesn't vanish. It waits. And every moment that passes without acknowledgement adds weight to the next one. This isn't escalation, it's exposure through absence. By now, the focus shifts away from the incident itself and settles on something quieter, the response. Not what was said, but how little was said. Not what was confirmed, but how carefully everything was framed. Because when something truly insignificant happens, clarity usually comes quickly. Here it didn't. What followed the circulation of the footage was a pause. Not confusion, not denial, a pause that felt deliberate. According to available reports, prison officials acknowledged medical attention without offering detail. Phrases surfaced that sounded reassuring on the surface, but avoided specifics. Being treated, being monitored, under care. Language that closes doors instead of opening them. That choice matters. In environments like this, wording isn't casual. It's selected, especially when visibility creates more risk than silence ever could. The goal isn't to explain, it's to stabilize, to prevent momentum from forming around unanswered questions. And questions are exactly what the footage created, not because it showed violence, but because it showed condition, the aftermath, the part that usually never leaves the facility. Once that kind of image exists, even briefly, it introduces doubt into assumptions people didn't realize they were holding. Assumptions about protection, about control, about how reality behaves once the doors close. Inside, reputation doesn't carry the same weight. Influence doesn't travel the same way. Situations change quickly, and outcomes don't always align with expectations formed on the outside. That's why the silence following this footage feels heavier than the footage itself. No official breakdown, no timeline offered, no clear explanation tying reports to visuals. Just distance. Distance can be practical. It can also be strategic. And when it shows up at the same moment clarity would settle things, it starts to feel intentional. You begin to notice how attention is being managed, not redirected loudly, just allowed to thin out. The assumption that interest will fade if nothing new is said, that without confirmation, conversation will exhaust itself. Sometimes that works, but sometimes silence does the opposite. It keeps the story alive by refusing to resolve it. This is where perception hardens, not into certainty, but into awareness. Awareness that something occurred significant enough to change posture, enough to move from confidence to caution, enough to replace explanation with containment. The footage didn't create that shift. It revealed it. And once revealed,
And then what's the odds that you would do that in front of the camera? Like that's one of the moments where he forgot he was on tape. But they consider a pre-existing beef, right? For 20 years, right? It's me being uncomfortable with him suggesting that he takes me shopping, or I looked at it like it was like a tester. Like maybe you'll come play with me type of thing, right? And it's not personal.
I think it's important to also let people know that the show is not completely the perspectives of people that did not like Sean. We weren't trying to just get the highlights, the salacious details, you know, that the real goal was to storytell. And not everyone needed to have an allegation to be a part of this project.
it can't be unseen. What matters now isn't whether more images surface. It's how long restraint holds, how long acknowledgement is postponed, how carefully the narrative remains compressed. Because every day that passes without clarity doesn't erase curiosity. It refines it. People stop asking what happened. They start asking why this is being handled this way. That question doesn't need answers to persist. It feeds on pattern, on timing, on the consistency of avoidance. This is where the story stops moving forward and starts pressing inward, toward systems, toward procedure, toward how power behaves when it's confined and visibility becomes a liability. Nothing dramatic needs to occur for that pressure to build. It's already there. And as long as silence continues to do the talking, the weight doesn't lift. It settles. At this point, the story stops feeling like news and starts feeling like posture. Not posture in front of cameras. Posture under constraint. What becomes noticeable now is how carefully everything is being held in place. The language stays narrow. The updates, if they come at all, avoid detail. The framing remains internal, managed, controlled, as if the goal isn't to inform, but to keep the surface from rippling. That tells you something. Because when situations inside facilities are routine, transparency is easier. Reports are filed, explanations arrive, timelines are offered. When details are withheld this consistently, it usually isn't because there's nothing to say. It's because saying more would create alignment that can't be undone. Alignment between reports and visuals, between expectation and reality, between what people assumed and what appears to have happened. This is where the environment matters. Inside, power doesn't announce itself. Its angst shift quietly. Influence doesn't travel the same way. Familiar protections thin out. Dynamics are negotiated without warning, and outcomes don't ask for permission to exist. That's why even unconfirmed reports of an altercation carry weight here. Not because incidents are rare, but because the expectation was different. The expectation was stability, insulation, a controlled experience that wouldn't leak into public view. The footage disrupted that expectation without needing to explain anything, and what followed reinforced it. No push to correct perception, no visible effort to clarify the sequence, just careful distance. Distance is useful. It buys time. It allows attention to drift. It relies on the assumption that without new material, interest will fade. That assumption works when curiosity is emotional. Here, curiosity has become observational. People aren't reacting. They're tracking, noting how long silence lasts, noting what's acknowledged and what isn't, noting how quickly the narrative moved from certainty to containment. Containment is a response. It doesn't deny, it doesn't confirm, it limits spread. And limitation becomes visible when compared to how other incidents are handled. This is where the story widens beyond the footage itself. It's no longer about images or reports. It's about how systems behave when visibility becomes a risk, how procedure takes precedence over explanation, how restraint is used to prevent questions from settling into conclusions. But restraint has a cost. The longer clarity is postponed, the heavier the absence becomes. Silence stops functioning as neutrality. It starts functioning as signal, a signal that something occurred significant enough to change how information moves. That realization doesn't require proof. It requires consistency, and consistency is everywhere here. As time passes, the footage doesn't need to circulate anymore to stay relevant. Its impact has already landed. It changed the frame. It shifted expectations. It introduced doubt where certainty once lived. From here on, every update will be read against that shift. Every non-update will be measured. Every choice to remain quiet will carry weight it didn't before. This isn't escalation, it's compression. A story narrowing into a space where avoidance becomes harder to maintain without drawing attention to itself. And once a narrative reaches that stage, it doesn't resolve on its own. It waits for the moment when silence stops being sufficient and acknowledgement becomes unavoidable. By now, the story isn't being driven by what people are saying. It's being driven by what they're choosing not to say. Every day that passes without detail adds weight, not because it confirms anything, but because it reinforces the same response pattern. Limited acknowledgement. Narrow language, no timeline, no context that would allow people to connect what they saw with what they are being told. That gap is doing the work now. In situations like this, clarity usually serves a purpose. It closes questions. It stabilizes perception. The decision to withhold it suggests something else is being protected. Not necessarily a secret, but a frame. A way the situation is meant to be understood, or not understood at all. And frames matter, because once people start filling in gaps on their own, control over interpretation weakens. Especially when there's visual material involved. Images don't argue, they linger. They sit in memory, waiting for something to either confirm or contradict them. Nothing has. Instead, attention is being managed through restraint. Updates, when referenced indirectly, stay minimal. The focus remains on care being provided, not on how it became necessary, on monitoring, not on cause. That choice keeps the story technically open while functionally contained. For now, what changes the dynamic is how familiar this approach feels. Not unique to this case, but consistent with how sensitive situations are handled when visibility creates risk. Delay, narrow scope, let time do the work explanation would otherwise have to do. That strategy depends on one thing, forgetting. But forgetting hasn't happened here, because the footage altered the baseline. It replaced assumptions with uncertainty, and uncertainty doesn't fade easily when it's reinforced by silence. People aren't looking for confirmation anymore. They're watching posture, how updates are shaped, how quickly attention is redirected elsewhere, how carefully the narrative avoids collision with what's already been seen. That kind of watching doesn't burn out. It sharpens. This is where the prison context becomes unavoidable. Inside, situations don't resolve on press schedules. They resolve according to environment, according to dynamics that aren't designed for public explanation. And when something breaks the expected rhythm, it leaves traces. The footage is one trace. The silence is another. Together, they suggest a disruption significant enough to change behavior. not just inside the facility, but in how information is allowed to move beyond it. From here, the story doesn't need escalation to remain active. It has structure now. Every non-update becomes part of it. Every carefully worded acknowledgement adds another layer. And the longer this holds, the clearer one thing becomes. Whatever happened mattered enough to alter the response playbook, enough to replace openness with containment, enough to rely on time instead of clarity. That choice doesn't end stories. It extends them. Because as long as the gap remains, people will keep watching not for what's revealed, but for what finally forces alignment between what was seen and what's being said. And until that happens, the pressure doesn't release. It stays. At this stage, the story stops feeling like it's waiting for confirmation and starts feeling like it's waiting for behavior to change. That's an important difference, because when something truly insignificant happens, the response usually expands with time. Details emerge, clarifications follow. The situation becomes easier to understand the longer it sits. Here, the opposite is happening. The longer it sits, the tighter everything becomes. Language doesn't widen, it narrows. The focus remains fixed on care, monitoring, procedure, not on cause, not on sequence, not on how things escalated to the point where medical attention became necessary in the first place. That omission isn't loud, but it's consistent. Consistency is what gives it weight. Inside facilities, incidents don't exist in isolation. They're logged, reviewed, categorized. The absence of publicly visible detail doesn't mean nothing happened. It means the handling of what happened is being prioritized over explanation. That's where perception shifts again. People stop asking whether the reports are accurate and start asking why the response looks the way it does. Why restraint is being maintained even as curiosity grows. Why the narrative remains compressed instead of clarified. Those questions don't require answers to persist. They require time, and time is doing something different here. Instead of letting attention fade, it's allowing comparison. Each day without clarity adds another reference point, another moment where silence could have been broken but wasn't, another choice to stay contained. That accumulation changes how everything is read. The footage doesn't need to resurface to remain relevant. It's already done its work. It altered expectations. It introduced the possibility that conditions inside don't match the assumptions formed outside, and once that possibility exists, it can't be unintroduced. This is where the prison environment asserts itself fully in the narrative. Inside, situations don't resolve according to public comfort. They resolve according to dynamics that aren't designed to be explained. Control isn't theoretical, it's physical, immediate, unforgiving. That reality doesn't need to be shown to be felt. The response tells you enough. What's happening now is a recalibration, not a collapse, not a crisis, a shift in how visibility is managed, how information is filtered, how much is allowed to move beyond the walls. Recalibration only happens when something disrupts the expected flow. That disruption doesn't have to be dramatic to matter. It just has to be real enough to change posture, to replace confidence with caution, to turn openness into restraint, and restraint, when sustained, becomes noticeable. By now, the story isn't asking for belief, it's inviting observation. Watch how long silence holds. Watch what gets repeated and what never appears. Watch how the narrative avoids collision with what people think they saw. That watching creates its own pressure, because eventually silence has to choose between continuing to contain the story or acknowledging it enough to release tension. Both options carry cost. Until that choice is made, the story doesn't move forward. It tightens. And in that tightening, one thing becomes clear. Whatever happened mattered enough to change the rules of engagement, enough to rely on time instead of clarity, enough to accept uncertainty as the safer option. That's not resolution. That's a holding pattern. And holding patterns don't last forever. By the time the story reaches this point, the most important thing has already happened. Not an announcement, not a confirmation, a shift. The narrative no longer feels controlled the way it did before. Not because new information surfaced, but because the response pattern has become too visible to ignore. Silence stopped feeling temporary. Restraint stopped feeling neutral. And once that happens, everything is read differently. The footage doesn't need to circulate anymore. The reports don't need to be repeated. The moment has already settled into memory. What people are watching now isn't the past. It's the present. How updates are handled, how carefully language stays contained, how long acknowledgement is postponed. That watching changes the balance, because control relies on fragmentation, on moments staying separate, on attention moving on before connections fully form. Here, that separation has collapsed. Everything exists in the same frame now. The images, the reports, the silence that followed, together. This is where the story stops behaving like a headline and starts behaving like pressure. Pressure that doesn't spike. It doesn't explode. It just sits there, steady, waiting for something to either confirm it or release it. Nothing has. And that absence is doing more work than any statement could. Inside, realities don't pause for reputation. They don't adjust for expectation. They operate according to environment, according to dynamics that don't need to be explained to be felt. Once that reality touches the public narrative, even briefly, it weakens the idea that everything is being managed the way people assumed. That idea doesn't vanish overnight. It erodes quietly. This is why the story doesn't end here. It doesn't need to. The question isn't what happened anymore. The question is how long this posture can hold. How long silence can function as containment instead of confirmation. How long restraint can replace clarity without drawing more attention to itself. Every day that passes without alignment adds weight, not because it proves anything, but because it reinforces the same choice. Delay, distance, minimal acknowledgement. That choice tells its own story. Eventually, narratives reach a point where they don't need new information to remain active. They're sustained by what hasn't been addressed, by what keeps being avoided, by how consistently the same response appears when clarity would settle things. This is that point. From here on, the story doesn't move forward loudly. It moves forward by being watched. Every update will be measured against this moment. Every silence will be compared to the last one. Every attempt to redirect will be weighed against what's already been seen. Not emotionally, structurally, and structure doesn't forget. This doesn't end with a reveal. It doesn't end with a denial. It doesn't even end with an explanation. It ends with a realization that once reality leaks, even briefly, narrative control weakens. And once silence becomes the loudest element in the room, it stops protecting the story. It preserves it. And preserved stories don't disappear. They wait.
18, like 19 years old. In the very beginning, after a while, over time, you condition for it.
The goal the film is trying to do is to let the audience kind of come in to ask questions like, were their decisions colored by certain things, and who got the benefit of the doubt, you know, in that?
Do you think that hip-hop culture was on trial as much as Sean Combs was?
Look, if I didn't say anything, you would interpret it as the hip-hop is fine with his behaviors. There's no one else being vocal. So you would look at it and just say, because that mind your business, or let me not say nothing about nothing. Those things, it would allow the entire culture to register as if they're for that.
If Sean Combs watches this, what do you think he's going to feel?
Like, wow, this is amazing. I think he's going to say, because you'll see people saying that. I mean, he may feel a different way about pieces and bits of it, but he knows the truth.